Hello everyone, today we talk about the agricultural expansion in high medieval Europe, giving some examples about different areas in Europe, mostly from the Iberian Peninsula and Central Europe. This is part, as we've seen, of a process that we normally find in history books termed as the revival of the year 1000, and which was rather part of a much larger, expansive process. In fact, was enormous and should be considered in its entirety, not trying to pinpoint like a moment in that time that actually lasted for long. What, like, at least manualistically speaking, we think it started from the 10th century, because by the 11th when the first scholars would address the question, they mostly found the first evidence in the sources. But this doesn't mean that it didn't happen before, and actually today we interpret as what happened in the 11th century actually as the proof that what we read and see as normal was happening, because in the previous centuries it had started to give those fruits later, right? So to be documented. This is a very important perspective that you always have to bear in mind, and not everything that we see is in fact the entirety, first of all, but it's also not necessarily what did not exist before or even afterwards, depending on the situation. And I can tell you, by experience, that in the Middle Ages, and generally speaking, yes, in times that were ever less documented, going back, not always, because in fact there could be a lot of backs and forths and ups and downs, rather in this case. You realize there was a life, a world, a universe, when you maybe stumble into a little detail, a little note, a certain phrase in a chronicle that tells you that what we think here like as a stagnating world, or the Middle Ages as the Dark Ages, were actually something incredible for its complexity and properly an enormity within itself. But we're not going to talk about this. We're going to stress that this expansive phase, we've made a video specifically to this end, happened between the 10th and the 13th century, right? And already in the 8th, or even before, there had been this phase. Then the crumbling of the Carolingian Empire had put an end to it, but this also being reviewed, because we don't really understand much when we look at socioeconomical aspects. We don't really have much of a certainty, because again, the quantitative data that is central for this kind of structural analysis is lacking most of the time. So we rely mostly on hints. By the late 13th century, this thing began to slow down, if not properly to stagnate, when not even to recede. And what happened later, we said many times, and we will keep talking about that too. And in general, there is a lot of debate revolving around these topics, because mostly economists do not ever agree with each other. I mean, historians of economics. Then society tells you lots of things that are ever more, not necessarily contradictory, because this was actually the real world, right? So the problem is rather us at this point, not really being able to reconstruct it adequately, but because it's incomplete, it's partial in a way. But again, never let yourself be fooled by the lack of evidence, right? As moderns, we have focused too much on just the evidence per se, and we have not been taught to properly frame it in a broader picture that also must rely on some kind of other sensible ideas that do not always require an evidence, and can also operate by analogy with a due care, etc. But this is one aspect. That today we will just look at a few examples, after all, to give you an idea of this, especially agricultural expansion. Actually, that of course went in parallel with the demographic one. In fact, what you see, the socioeconomical history was studied and intensively um, mostly by a Marxist historiography that stressed the importance of the means of production, of the capitals, of the stuff. But as a matter of fact, today, and so also on the wake of some kind of progressistic technologistic bias that also the the Western world kind of bought at some point, independently from political ideologies, and that again, it's a great problem in the last 200-300 years in our world, because these guys that we study here, back in the Middle Ages, didn't even think like that, right? They didn't have that pattern of interpretation. They had a completely different mindset. So, but today we are simply realizing, in many ways, this expansion was not due to a single triggering factor, especially on a structural or kind of materialistic point of view, right? People say, it was the technology that produced the new, better results. Actually, there is no evidence of this. There is no evidence. If anything, technological advancement was a consequence already of when the development had already happened, right? Because you don't. It's like an industrial revolution. It started because Europeans began to have enough raw resources that they needed to mechanize the process of working, because they had so many of them that they lacked labor force, and so that sparked the technological innovation. Now, this is basically always the case in the history of economics. As for the high medieval expansion, the technological card is not really shown, because actually in some of the most fertile areas that were actually the most developed politically and socially, some innovations, technologically speaking, didn't even start, right? There were some, for example, the plows that you see, the most advanced ones, were actually invented in areas like, Bohemia, Moravia, like Central Europe, that were not really on the fore in terms of technological development, whereas in the Mediterranean, where yes, there were more fertile lands, but there was also kind of a greater technological development, especially in those centuries. You realize that some of them kept using the older Roman plow. Even there, it's impossible to make a simplistic double thread connection. I mean, the double thread existed, of course, but to say it's not a directly proportional connection either, right? The plow, for example, we made a video about that, spread also in some of the most advanced agricultural areas of Europe, like Lombardy in that point. But in other places that were still advanced, didn't happen the same way. Others have said, it's climate change, right? We noticed that lots of people began to appear too, that there was a massive demographic increase, albeit even there, we can't really track it. We can just speculate, right? There is this massive medieval civilization that ended with the 14th century, from which, much better data and views of, properly of the abundance of evidence of documents changed really the game. But before that, we don't really that much. We don't really know that much. It's a very scanty, kind of episodical form of documentation in many ways. Even when you have lots of them, like you may have lots of that in one single place, maybe the one next door, you don't have the same evidence, because it was lost, right? And this has nothing to do with the time being, because maybe an archive went destroyed, I don't know, during the 17th century. So you can't let yourself be fooled by that perspective either, connecting it to the medieval cause directly. And so people said it was climate change. Why did people expand? Well, because, it's possible. I mean, all these things are possible. So also technology by a lesser degree does cause improvement. Also, yes, surely we do seem to see there was kind of a climate warming during the time. But can we explain what happened politically and socially, but at massive scale, just by that standard, right? Also, humans tend to expand. I mean, they're not like crops, like plants. At some point, climate change happens. Depending on warming and cooling, there's an increase or decrease of the populace. I mean, human beings actively operate to achieve goals, right? So this expansion was just somebody simply came up by saying, okay, there had been a big contraction even there in the early Middle Ages. Why wouldn't humans, there was less people, there was more to exploit. Why wouldn't humans gradually, expand, treasure, invest, etc., and make the thing themselves. Yes, humans can mess up everything or also succeed brilliantly all by themselves, right? You don't really need climate change to be inserted as the decisive factor in the equation. And in fact, what we see normally is that most of this expansion was actually not due to like a prosper situation at all, right? It seems that, where people had enough resources, they mostly remained where they were. It's when they lived badly that they needed to find other land to work, because they had literally to feed the people, right? That increased because people made children anyway, and it was kind of a much more intensively and homogeneous rate than today, because it was connected to that world, and you have to give them something to eat. So this picture is very variegated on the base of the of the local history, as far as we can do it. There was definitely in this process, as you understand it, in a broader agricultural expansion, and there is a broader agricultural success of some form, because we really see that this is like a state that expanded, like where you really see the deforestation, really see the growth, the population of certain areas were wastelands before, etc. So this was a success in positive terms, and it does reflect a social cohesion. A social cohesion that in this regard would naturally reflect itself on the improvement, also for example, the rights of the populations. So from a political point of view, because these people in theory were free. And this is the first case of Switzerland, whose rural populations benefited greatly at this point in history from the colonizations of new lands. Right, Switzerland at the time was kind of a primitive, right, a rough area. There hadn't been a major economical development, etc. It was in the Alps, essentially, we're talking about. These were the areas that historically had kind of less developed, just the mountain areas. But exactly in the mountain areas in Europe, you do find, in the moment of greater, in fact, demographic expansion, and also the connection. So whatever the reason, you can say it's climate change. It's also, think about, the world was expanding all around. So there were new opportunities. There was more know-how. There was properly the broadening of the horizons for an active purpose, right? And so what you find in Switzerland is this extremely important movement of people, properly migrations, and properly a great work of putting land at work, in fact, by especially the inhabitants of the valleys, the Walser, in fact, in the Central Alps. These were, we think, ethno-anthropologically, they were essentially the descendants mostly of the Alemannic people back in the day, and they, in this period, in high medieval times, began to expand further, mostly towards the south in these valleys, also upland, because these are still today some of the communities that live at the highest level, the highest altitude in Europe at the time. So they literally pressed, right, to have new land. That tells you also the strength, the motivation, the cohesion, the effort, because it costed to do that. And so this tells you also the determination of the people themselves, that at this point probably had the means or the needs, or both, in fact, to achieve this new settlement. And in parallel of Lower Europe, the vast movement of conquest of the uncultivated land reveals itself a decisive factor in the changing of the rustics' living conditions, and also of push towards the constitution of organisms provided with liberty. Always remember that while this was objectively the peak of feudal the feudal system in many ways. I mean, not these specific examples necessarily, but Europe was feudal at this time. Actually, during the High Middle Ages, the expansion was so great that this encompassed also those classes that were not feudal in nature, right? The great expansion and consolidation of feudalism is in the late Middle Ages, as a matter of fact. It was nothing but not like the increase of freedom and liberty in the late Middle Ages. This is a positivistic, progressistic mythology that was stressed also by certain specific countries that in modern age had to show the fact that they were coming on the fore more, and saying, the Renaissance was increase of liberty. Are actually not at all, right? The peasants were by far freer in high medieval times. And again, freer doesn't necessarily mean better off, like in absolute terms. Again, these were incredibly primitive times. I mean, Europe, half of a millennium before there was still the Roman Empire. I mean, let's picture this also, what these areas in Central Europe actually were. And the expansion, in fact, that these areas had in the Middle Ages surpassed, in relative terms, also the rates of Southern Europe, right, of post-Roman Europe, especially, well, actually England, that is still post-Roman Europe, that not be massively Romanized as other more, what were the leading economies here, essentially France, Italy, etc. But they expanded faster in relative terms. So you see this impressive booming. Germany, in this regard, the German lands, as you know, with the Ostsiedlung, made videos, and we will talk about it in the next example, had this massive projection northeast, etc. And there were really lots of people. And again, the main idea, as we were saying before, is that these migrations, because they were real migrations, it's as if they were the continuation of the migration era, right? The materialistic historiography has showed this thing as, no, this where the peasantry was, connected to other hierarchies. It was like kind of a migration era, like the same reasons that brought these people to move in a way. Or probably even the modalities and the same places that produced this, like a place like Germany, Northern Europe, those that had less resources locally to satisfy the need of an increasing population. And again, this is one of the main explanations we give for the migration era, the Viking era, right? It's in many ways the same thing. It is true that it was better controlled, right, and that the success of the same peasant expansion was connected to the hierarchy, properly to the lords, but sometimes it was autonomous. And that's why an example like the one of the Walser is important, because they were really just, the Swiss mountaineers would maintain that degree of autonomy and freedom in a way. At this point, we're still, yes, kind of under some feudal lords in the area. It's not before the 13th, especially the 14th century, will reach their own, they will be able to even fight for their rights on the battlefield against the feudal elite. But still, the sense of the Sippe, right, was the ancient Germanic agricultural community. It was there, was basically the same thing. The important, though, in fact, is to consider that the peasant communities were in a way freer, in relative terms, in this society were freer, right? Because it was a moment where the expansion was so great, and it had really never happened before, that even the elites didn't really care about it. Like, if somebody was expanding outside of their control, because they were making so much income through that also simply they wouldn't really have the tools in those times, given that the feudal states and their administrations and bureaucracies were yet to be formed. This is something that would take shape, and especially in certain countries in Europe in the 13th century. And exactly, in fact, for example, in Central Europe, didn't quite have that grip at all. That there was like an factually uncontrolled expansion of the peasantry that remain, and also of the communes. I mean, think this is the same centuries of the same urban booming in Europe, right? So those were definitely non-feudal communities, even when they were under some feudal rule, right? They would mostly struggle for their own autonomies. We have seen, I don't know, how the burghers of Cologne expelled the archbishop. That basically was a landlord all around, one of the most powerful ecclesiastical principalities in Germany. But in the city, they wouldn't let him in, right? So here, some peasants from, let's say, at the bottom of society do a bit the same thing. And because simply the masters were not knocking at the doors, also because they would just were installed very often in most powerful, say, more advanced, richest areas, that they wouldn't go up in the Alpine highlands like the Walser to make money, right? But at the same time, also the Alpine aspect and the mountain migrations are vital, because the mountains had less resources themselves for population expansion. In fact, what you see, for example, in mercenarism in this time in Europe, that many mountaineers made up the soldiery, because very often, if the local communities didn't have enough to satisfy them, they would have to send them out to go fight. This was the ancient, migratory mindset that existed also in connection with military activity that since it was millennia old. I mean, just think about the Crusades in general. Even that is a broader example at a continental level of how consistent this mechanism was. And other times it was properly active conquest, right? And that's where we talk about the Reconquista, because in the Iberian Peninsula, there were actually massive demographic, agrarian, military problems, because there you had properly a Christian north who was expanding, by the way, from the least developed areas into this enormous peninsula. I mean, as I often say, recall France is larger than Spain, but if you pick Spain plus Portugal, extensionally speaking, that's larger even than France. I mean, it's immense. Something extremely varied also in terms of climate, of terrain, etc. There are different, in fact, and consequently also different communities, as you know, at that point, that had, and this is the point, also political prerogatives. We made a video about the Mudeyyars, for example, this Muslim and Jewish communities that were forcibly, they were integrated with their own liberties within the Christian government, that especially at the beginning with the capture of Toledo under Alfonso VI, the Castilian Leonese ruler would style himself as emperor of everybody, of Christians, Muslims, and Jews, because you couldn't really do it without the latter in the Iberian Peninsula. They were massive communities, demographically speaking. And so there was a frontier, there was permanent warfare, right? The Reconquista, the whole Iberian culture was essentially created in function of an armed struggle. And this went on for 700 years, right? So you can imagine the implications of this, because also the war was changing the landscape. I mean, this enormous frontier between the Christian and Muslim areas was, for example, changing. Some areas were cultivated in Roman times, in Visigothic times, even in Muslim times. When the Reconquista arrived, these spaces could not support. It was not much about the distractions. Of course, raiding warfare was there to damage, but properly the stability in the first place. People wouldn't like to invest in there. So there was an enormous transition from agriculture to pastoralism. We made videos because this would come to has the transhumance, and the wool industry would have an enormous impact in the Iberian economy, especially at the end of the Middle Ages, right? This happened, but especially in the Iberian Peninsula by far. It was an enormous, the largest in Europe, wool industry. But still, it's wool industry, right? It comes from herds. It comes from a type of an economy that is not, the most advanced, because these lands had lost in part that potential due to the permanent militarization of it. At the same time, it was the problem of a military colonization, because the Reconquista at some point, especially after Las Navas, was as you know, was overwhelming, but exactly because the Castilians incorporated all the Andalusia all together. And while this was an enormous success for the Christians, still in terms of local administration, it was also a problem, because the conquest had been so fast. It's as if they had broken a dam and it had overflowed everywhere, but they lacked still, as we were saying before, even in that sense, the statal control on that. So that there were, I don't know, we've seen it, for example, in that video about medieval Portugal, how factually there were people, I don't know, from England, from France, that would simply, as mercenaries, would arrive in the Iberian Peninsula. They would carve their own seigneury in a completely autonomous way, and the local lords, I don't know, the Portuguese, the Castilians, so were actually fine with that, because those guys settled without even a real permission. Eventually, maybe they would get from the local kings, even being integrated in the local, by marrying to the local monarchy and becoming nobility, practically. And that's an overlooked dynamic that occurred in those lands, in fact. And so it was a patchwork of territorial dominations that didn't quite follow often kind of a pre-planned picture. And so in many ways, even the peasant liberties were important, because if the Muslims had attacked again, you needed properly manpower to defend the lands. And this went in parallel operationally, of course, with the knights, with the feudal elite, with this big Iberian monarchies as they were being formed, especially the Castilian one, as you know, was massive. It was a true feudal monarchy. Also the Portuguese one, even if it was smaller, the Aragonese crown, as you know, had kind of a very different political institutional tradition. Also didn't really participate in the Reconquista by land, rather on the coasts, yes, but it was a bit of a different reality, not that distant actually. I mean, there was an important continental expansion as well, but it's Castile that mostly sees this problem and knows how to exploit it well, because at the end of the day, by the late Middle Ages, the Castilian monarchy was actually very well balanced politically and institutionally. Now, the liberties were important. Granting a liberty essentially meant to grant autonomies would lead to benefits. Of course, the polities of this time were plagued by the excess of liberties. I mean, the as you know, we've seen many times in the juridical order of the Middle Ages, essentially law was intended as the customs of the people that were essentially considered as inalienable. I mean, they were God-given, right? And there was all a problem with the universal powers, just the royal powers, etc. To determine how much of those should be handed to the monarchy, in fact, because it was evident that just political fragmentation could not operate. You had to have a single unit, a single leadership, a unity of intents, and so on. But the juridical justification was that the monarchs had to operate in order to defend the rights of the people. So, of course, were negotiated. So, personal freedom, for example, and the allodial possessions of the cultivated lands were a big deal during the Reconquista, because literally this space that had been left empty by the Muslims and that was still threatened because the Muslims continued counteroffensives on everyone in a while, and needed to strengthen the local populace that had been dispersed by the war. I mean, as we've seen, there were still Muslims and Jews that were consistently making up the Christian ruled population, in fact. But the countryside had to be refilled. So there were rural communities that benefited from the kings of privileges and exemptions to remain strong, to remain like a bulwark in front of possible Muslim coming back, right? So personal freedom in properly as peasants, right? Also, this was also connected ideologically to properly to the older idea of Romano-Germanic origin, that whoever was free had the duty and the privilege to fight. So personal freedom meant literally, these people have also a broader autonomy that can make them afford the means of defense. And the militias in Spain, cavalry, infantry militias were important, were an important component of the Iberian armies. We'll have to come back at some point because they're a bit overlooked. Even though the Iberian Peninsula was factually dominated by cavalry, by heavy cavalry, right? Even when you see, the Almogalvares, the Catalans, all these things, if you see how the armies fought at home, they were dominated by heavy cavalry, but by far, right? And these infantries were effective in certain cases, but actually they were not very courageous. They were mostly light infantry, agile one. Also, the fight a la Jineta, and I guess, it was also kind of, it's not even a Moorish influence, like the Iberian warfare, since think about the Cantabrians, right? They always fought like that. It's not much Moorish Islamic influence. It's just the nature of the Iberian Peninsula that had always been this big frontier at all times in history, with this enormous plains then dotted with these fortresses, these hill forts, and in between you had to raid each other in the process. So it was quite important. These were not so courageous infantries, for example, such very heavily loaded, trained, like I don't know, the Italian ones or something. They were particular in many ways. They were lighter and more based in this kind of hit and run tactics. That was that's an interesting thing we have to see. And the Allodia, because naturally you don't just let the peasants rule, right? There were noblemen, there were knights, were, as we've seen, settled on the frontier, and if you granted them that castle, that land in allodium, that is as a full property, could factually not be alienated, not even by the king. You gave these guys a reason to stand their ground, because it was their own ground, right? This is the older, also the Romans operated like this. The Roman colonies, differently from the Latin ones, were properly military garrisons in frontier lands, because the privilege came from being a full Roman citizen, as the one who would fight for Rome and having the greatest reward of that land in full possession, but still with what came as a military commitment, as the Romans had to remain fit in that regard. So the militarization of the Iberian Peninsula is very similar, right? And there is, generally speaking, a migration also from the north, because also in the Iberian Peninsula you have something similar to the idea that the poorer lands of the north didn't have, in fact, enough resources to maintain the population growth, and so there was a migration towards the south, right? You do see this demographic trend as well. In fact, the majority of the population in the Iberian Peninsula was concentrated naturally in the Muslim south. Eventually the Christians came to rule. And perhaps the most famous page of agricultural demographic expansion in high medieval Europe that happened with a slight chronological delay, possibly because these lands were, or the lands of origin were more depopulated, and so maybe they kind of it took more time to fill them before overflowing, was indeed the Ostsiedlung, right? So in this process that sees the Germanic colonization of, as you know, great parts of Central and Eastern Europe, and more in general, the operations of mowing and of bonification. Again, think what Europe was in high medieval times, especially in the areas that had never really seen dramatic. Let's be honest. Outside of post-Roman Europe, the cities as we intend them, like properly civitates, with a bulky stone infrastructure with a massive, net communication, where the countryside was all connected with the internet, it had never quite existed, right? It was a wilder area, right? Germany itself, that was still kind of more exposed to civilization, was incredibly wild and rough at this point. And you see it even just if you study, history of art, you see properly the mentality, the vision, the form of the world that is different. Even if they were kind of close to France, that was booming at that time, had the best thing, still that roughness of the land was you almost can't live the awakening of that world through seeing the expansion of their art. And what is important is that it's massive, right? It's also by scale. The sheer amount of extensions that were covered by this process were incredible. And again, areas that had not really been populated before. I mean, some of course were populated, but also being destroyed, ravaged, also because think about the Slavic instability. We made a video recently about the Germanic Slavic frontier. Those were, think about Lübeck. Lübeck was refounded in the 12th century on the base of a pre-existing Slavic settlement that had gone destroyed during the clashes among the same Slavs. Right? And the fact that these cities had to be rebuilt, it tells you how that factually nothing had really remained out of them. Right? So they were refounded from scratch. This is a bit the same. So that tells you what also they were before, something really modest by urban standards. We can't even use this adjective. It's like, the emporia, the entrenched forts that became kind of market centers during the Viking era in the Baltic. Those are places that were all abandoned at the end of the Viking era because they didn't have basically any other purpose than that trade connection based on piracy and of slave trade. It's that when those things ended on a large scale, the settlements didn't really have a function or even properly the infrastructural base for serving too much, right? So these were areas that never really seen permanent, stable settlements of a real sort to even centralize in a political sense. We have seen the difficulties of the Scandinavian and the Slavic monarchies in taking off properly. Even up to late medieval times, there was something really exhausting, right, to keep together. It was terrifying. So these were reflected also on the stabilization of the land. The Germans were different because the Germans had been brought forcibly, as you know, under the essentially Frankish rule, one another, and they had been westernized fully by this point, already previously to this point. And so they were actually operating with Western models, and that entailed consolidation. This is how you see, that the Polish monarchy that was also westernizing process because the Frankish model overflowed everywhere, right? It affected even the Byzantine world, the Muslim world, etc. But the Eastern you got, and the more problematic the situation was, because Poland took an awful lot to stabilize politically. We made a video some week ago exactly on this topic under the PS. It were just a sum of principalities, like a bit like in the Kievan Rus. Whereas you have the Teutonic Knights arriving and creating basically the single most centralized system that existed in the region by far, because it was it had the plus of being an ecclesiastical state, so it was administered in a particular way, but still, right, it was a real state, and even there it was built from scratch, from German knights, settlers, peasants, etc. It was a massive, in fact, even as migration proper, sometimes even deportation, right? The lords of places like in northern Germany, this is especially the force that moved, it was behind this thing, northeastern Germany. Sometimes they said to the peasants, It's not that they didn't need to deport them, but they would simply tell them, look, if you go live there in that new lands that we have created on the Baltic, you will be exempted from these and these taxes. You will have some rights, some freedoms for trade, etc. And yeah, it was kind of a wild land with a bunch of savages in the forest surrounding, making raids and taking you and burning you alive because you were a Christian. Well, but still, accept that, which I would say could happen even in Germany by certain standard, but it was not really the worst thing that could happen to you in perspective. So you would go live there, and this whole thing succeeded. That is, some areas, as you know, were properly Germanized. It became essentially German islands that up to before the ethnic cleansing and genocides of the 20th century were islands of German-speaking people that were compactly so, and traditionally in the frame of the Ancien regime, properly living as something separated that stretched, in fact, from Germany to Crimea, to the Baltic, to Russia. I mean, it's still, and still there are traces of this, and this was a massive migration phenomenon. That, yes, it also mixed with some progressed Germanic islands here and there. I mean, think about the Goths of Crimea, like those things that, like, it became mostly not myths, but say some kind of ethno-anthropological interest, especially in the 18th and the 19th century, but we can't fully trace, right? But yes, we do see some still in the phenotypes, in part even in the language that some went extinguished, but it's like, I don't know, the Alemanni, before we mentioned the Walser, but if you study, I don't know, there are some alpine areas between Switzerland, Austria, Italy, where you see that there are still, I think they are extinguishing completely now, but like, we think these people speak, or spoke, the closest thing that existed to Alemannic, basically, like to the language of the Elbe Germans that could have been spoken by the Alemanni, the Bavarians, and the Longobards back in the day. And you can't really trace where these people come from, because it's not that we understand whether they were, I don't know, traces of the Teutons that came through the 2nd century BC remain always there, if they are from the migration era, maybe just they are medieval colonists. We don't know. We have no idea. There's no way to trace that. We just know that, they correspond to some things that by our historical ethnoanthropological parameters, linguistical ones, genetic ones, do look like and sound like, in fact, a relic of that Central European migrational culture we could assess. And it's an incredibly fascinating topic, by the way, that I think it's severely underrated as well. But consider what population movement practically meant in history. Like, people today say, oh, look, I descend, I am from this country, descend from this people that were here 2,000 years ago. Yeah, but why? How do you know, right? Even if, altogether, yes, you kind of evenly look ethnically related to that, but how your ancestors weren't like from the next door country, largely, or there's not a phenotype or a genotype even divided on the base of countries. It's kind of silly. It's a complete misunderstanding of what genetics it's basically about, and people's migrations are really about. So we have just to get over the fact that certain things, like, we cannot understand, if not by gross, but really gross and thus unsatisfactory degree. So don't flatter yourself that much from thinking what you descend to. Just think to achieve something in your own life, which seems to be something that really nobody cares about today. And then maybe you will have some admiration, not really what you look like or where you come from. Nobody gives a shit about, frankly. Even less the ancestors that you had. And I'm talking for any kind of thing like, your ancestors killed and raped yet because, yours did to whoever you are, wherever you come from. Right? So, yeah, you can be absolutely fine. You should be neutral to the thing. Because, again, is your a compliment? No. So what the hell gives a damn about it? So it was hard work. Again, the mowing, the deforestation, this area is covered in swamps and forests that, interestingly enough, during the crisis of the 14th century, very often came back as such. Like, that with the massive demographic drop of the Black Death, we know that forests re-expanded. Nature took over some areas. I mean, hell, we have seen it even with when we were in lockdown with COVID, with wild boars kind of entering the city, the metropolitan outskirts, right? You can't imagine when 1/3 of the European population was wiped out, and only what the beauty of what it should have been, like with all the green. Have you ever thought of the green that was in the Middle Age? It was beautiful, and so even just think about this ideologically. I mean, the idea that the ideas that were spreading at the time were kind of more humanistically oriented towards the idea that that mankind was regulating the world, was molding the world, was shaping the world at God's image through such hard work as well. But at the same time, makes you understand how also intense all the fatigue, the enormous work that existed behind it. I mean, think about creating, I don't know, channels, dams in the Middle Ages, right? And the toponymy of Europe is full of these things, because it shows how big that, again, high medieval civilization really was in terms of demographic and economical power to really reshape the landscape on their own need, at least, let's say. And the rural communities born in relation to this mowing activity, to which, as we've seen, a great geographic and social mobility of the populations is accompanied by, it happened, let's say, thanks to the convergence of the economical and political interests of the seigneurial aristocracy, but at the same time provides to the peasant communities autonomies on their own. Because at the end of the day, here I will not digress on the importance, of course, of the aristocratic, the seigneurial aristocratic initiative in all of this. This thing was guided by the lords in a way or another, right? But as we were saying before, the lords didn't have full control on the people. They were actually incentivizing them to move, because otherwise they would have not really done it on their own. They didn't have the full control on the populace. Feudal Europe was not like that. No polity in the world ever had a full control on the populace, ever. It's factually physically impossible to attain. But it benefited from this movement. It benefited from the tolls. So for something that was secondary, after all, because taxation was ridiculous for our for our standards, like it were a few points percentage. Sometimes today we have, we're using in terms of tenths, and already at the time, few points per tenth were enormous. Also because, again, the crop rate was ridiculous. These economies were incredibly fragile, again, compared to our own. But the people, in fact, exactly for that, because they knew that if they screwed up, they would starve to death, because of scarcity, etc. They were deeply entrenched also in this new land. They would keep it, they would hold it, right? Think about, I don't know, the Frisians or the Dithmarscher on the North Sea, right, in today's Netherlands and Germany. Those were, for example, the protagonists of some of the battles of the infantry victory, or the pure infantry victories in the early 14th century. Why? Because, there were some local lords that wanted to impose their control on them, and they said, screw you, and they took up their arms and fought to the death. And these were some of the most radically underdeveloped communities in Europe. Next door, I don't know, to Friesland, were the Flemish, they were instead the most radically developed and rich communities in Europe, that could do the same thing against the French knights. Say, so don't stress too much the economical factor as a matter of interpretation, but the reason why they would defend their land, and knowing also how to use it strategically, because they would bottle the the heavy knights into these corridors between the marshes and butcher them down, preventing them from maneuvering and so on. Also, the Swiss would do this, as you know, with the valleys, in the ambushes and so on. Were fighting for their own land. Like, they were fighting essentially to avoid annihilation. And the brutality of their lifestyle, just in terms, not much because of war, of the threat posed by war, but just for the fact that people would die like flies at the time, just would make them seem, of course, their land themselves, right? And not because of romantic nationalistic ideas fabricated in the 19th century, because literally they would have otherwise starved to death, right? So, why would you face the single most advanced military in the world to risk being butchered, cut to pieces by it? Because kind of starving to death may be even worse. At least if you're cut down by a sword, you die, hopefully within some short time. Starving to death is really something else, right? And in many cases, of course, not all of them won, but especially in the long run, in a way. But at least this shows, in part, how, politically and socially, how powerful the presence of this peasantry was in these areas. And of course, we should go case by case. I hope we will I hope to live long enough to make at least some the videos about the battles of the Frisians and of the Dithmarschen, match of one of many others, because that also tells you the story of a people, as always war does. So among the most numerous possible examples of such autonomies, we can consider a population charter released between 1180 and 1184 by the Bishop of Halberstadt, that is in today's Sachsen-Anhalt, northeastern Germany. This was essentially issued in favor of the men committed in the bonification, in fact, of that swampy area of Saxony that is comprehended between the rivers Oka and Bode. Wild areas, exactly those that we were talking about before. And besides precising and fixing the rights and the work performance on the lands that were brought to culture, this charter established that every man had to be free from any kind of previous bond of personal dependency, that they would have to have full liberty of movement, and that they had to enjoy the right to use the common uncultivated land. We will see all these things in detail, and that they could transmit in inheritance their own goods. And the jurisdiction of each village that was built, literally settled by this work of bonification, belongs to the Bishop of Halberstadt, who exercises his justice in 3 yearly placita through one owns nuncius, and in cooperation with the magista of the village, to whom pertains the justice, quote, pro furtis et aliis excessibus, which means regarding the thefts and other excesses, as it is expressed, and to whom in fact is also 1/3 of the judiciary income, and naturally the other 2/3 are destined to the bishop. But this is a quite fascinating example, because first of all, if you look at the rights that the freemen that were becoming such exactly for living there enjoyed in these villages, see, they are really big, right? So what does this mean? It means that if you were a peasant living in a land under the conditions of a certain lord, etc., and you, say, escaped from there, wanted to go live in these lands near to Halberstadt, you would become completely free. Let's say you were a serf, even, you would enjoy these freedoms, these rights, and become properly free. So your previous bonds would have been solved. This is quite interesting because it means that the same bishop that, as you understand, is the lord of the land, is basically putting himself on the fore and saying, nobody touches the people who live here. Also because I basically started the thing, it's my land, right? It was about land more of the people in a sense, but the people, of course, were the ones who would make the land rich, because otherwise, if nobody works on it, that's the point. So this is a good proof of how, the bishop wouldn't even need to move people to this land, because people would just hear what kind of rights were enjoyed there, and it would flow there, right? And we don't have to think, in fact, these lands were particularly fruitful. Again, they were pretty bad areas. They had to be bona fide, reclaimed, deforested. So, a lot of work, but still, even properly the condition of freedom was an enormous thing for the end of the 12th century, especially in a country like Germany, where usually people were somebody's people, right? There were other serfs or something that, however, were highly under the local lords. And in this sense, these people were still bound to the local lord, because he was the only one who provided with those rights for them, for these people living in that land. So of course, were specific rights, as we've seen, regarding how much these people had to work, because they had to work, not just coming there. Also they had simply to leave. Nobody would have maintained them anyway, so they were kind of forced, but there was naturally to work by the contingencies. But this work was regulated, so that the work would not be hampered by anything in that regard. As we've seen, the complete dissolution of every previous bond of personal dependency, and this is valid also for freemen, by the way. So if you had contract, this is also part of the competition and the lack of regulation. We've seen very often how Germany was quite politically fragmented, and how local lords built factually their own local lordships kind of in an autonomous way, also with quite violent means. So this idea that we just call people, it already tells you also how many people there were who needed that, and this does reflect that kind of demographic expansion that in Germany especially was quite strong at this point in relative terms. Also, these people had free movement liberty. That is to say, they could move across the land however they wanted. Also, they enjoyed the right to cultivate in the common areas, because there were areas that were kind of private, of course, others that instead were like all still to bona fide. As we were saying before, this enormous extensions of uncultivated land, where this happened in other times in history. Think about the Ager Publicus in Roman time. These were enormous areas the Romans conquered after conquest, and they said everybody can kind of settle there and start their own farm, like the state will not check it. This is exactly what is happening here. Right, people have rights to cultivate out there, right? Because that's factually also when they were actually built their own goods. In fact, the last condition, if you read, is that they could eventually transmit in inheritance their own goods. So that again, there had to be no ambiguity on what the ultimate goal of these people were, to tie them to the land stably, because they had to benefit from it. Everybody would have liked to settle there on average, right? So, and staying there, their own descendants and so on, because these rights were enjoyed also in line of, I don't know, my father had worked there, my grandfather worked there. We are those people in that community under that Bishop of Halberstadt that provided us with these rights. This was a charter, by the way. So it was issued, it was law. So if these were German subjects, if some of them had gone to the German king, say ideal, and said, look, this bishop told me I could do this and that, and he's not doing that. That was also kind of something that was fixed properly as a contract. And also the government is interesting, especially the exercise of justice, as we've seen, as the bishop is the lord of the land. And there are 3 placita. You know that the term comes from the Latin placet, which means we like that. It's liked. It refers to the approval that eventually was, in the issue that was the order, the sentence that was issued in that circumstance, 3 times a year. So that was a moment where anybody had grievances, there was a problem, could speak, right? And the bishop would operate through a nuncius of his, so an agent that acted on his behalf with episcopal authority, juridical authority towards these people, because again, this has nothing to do with the ecclesiastical world. Here the bishop is, he has a diocese in Halberstadt, whatever, he does his ecclesiastical function, but here he's acting as a secular lord with secular people, right? So that's the kind of power the bishops had factually. And this nuncius would cooperate with what is called the village's magister, so the Burgmeister. That is a bit like it was probably elected, was a representative of the same peasant community. It was like they had the local mayor, let's put it in this way. That, of course, acted also as a medium, because the grievances, problems that had to be solved likely were not just about one guy. These were still kind of sort of clanic societies where problems emerged mostly among a family and another, like a bit like the mob, etc. And he had to be a man of some authority, some competence and expertise, and would cooperate with the bishop agent during this tribunal. There's this meeting where they had to solve legal problems, and in fact the magister was entrusted with this sort of police function locally, right? There could be issues about, again, the property, the freedom, and those were maybe complex because there were other lords around, there were other communities around, so problems could emerge in that regard. It had to be discussed more comprehensively, but the meister had to cope with thefts, with other crimes, and maintain public order, right? So he probably had somebody working for him, right? And he had to bring on the fore properly the thefts, and had to be punished, etc. And for this, he actually would earn 1/3 of the judicial incomes that were enormous, presumably, like 1/3 for the entire community. And as you know, justice was one of the single most important sources of revenues in medieval Europe, because especially as crime was concerned, these were smaller crimes, let's say, that he was entrusted to cope with. But in general, the whole other judicial issues could be larger, and so being a magister there was really a good career, right? Could risk something, somebody wanted to kill you, right? But it still worked. It was a good job. And the other 2/3 of the incomes naturally are destined to the bishop, that therefore profits dramatically. He surely had some tolls there. I mean, I don't know, this is typical feudal Europe. I mean, maybe there was a mill, there was a bridge, whatever. Every time you had to use them, you had to pay something, right? And so the bishop would become powerful. I mean, consider that these were the lands around the Halberstadt, so they, I mean, the same town benefited from it, and the bishop from it, right? So it was a big deal. And that's how you make money. You attract people to work there, or you give them a reason to organize themselves with autonomies, with freedoms, etc. And in the process, you become richer. And they become satisfied and hopefully richer too. And generally speaking, the bishop, as we've seen, has the upper hand anyway, because this, the lord of the land has organized everything. This tells you, naturally, how important being a lord and how directing this initiative, how remunerative directing this initiative was for them. Without the episcopal capitals, this thing could not be done. These walled communities would have not existed. These were literally people coming from elsewhere to create another new, brand new community under the bishop that had the seigneury on it. So these are, I think, are good examples of really how things could work practically in such circumstances, and you understand how logical it is, the whole thing. There was this great force that was channeled to obtain an important, to build something more, something positive, something orderly, something hierarchically disciplined, and in fact with a public, with a local order, let's put it in this way, and some kind of of authority properly, because it's not just about local police. It's the bishop that when things are going wrong, or maybe he has his retinues, he has his knights, he has his ministeriales, and those guys beat quite hard, and that's what everybody knew, right? So always the power, always the deterrent, always the safety, the security, because that's the first thing of every civilization. So hopefully we'll keep talking about these things. There are many examples from all these lands we have listed. There are some Transylvanian areas that have a regulation between lords and peasants. It would famously take the name of Weistum. There are so many other examples that we will see. However, let's go step by step. Let's not hurry. For today, I stop it here. I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. And for now, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.